The strangest thing about freedom is that the people who deserve it most are usually the ones the galaxy tries hardest to take it from. The trade station orbiting the dusty world of Carthos 9 hummed with the tired rhythm of commerce, air recyclers whispering through steel vents while cargo haulers drifted past the panoramic windows like slow metal whales in the black. Jack Walker stepped off his battered utility shuttle with grease still on his hands and 32 credits left in his account, which was just enough to buy fuel cells and maybe a lukewarm cup of station coffee if he was lucky. The place smelled like hot circuitry, recycled air, and 1,000 different alien cuisines trying unsuccessfully to coexist in the same corridor. Jack had been fixing ships across frontier stations for almost 8 years, and places like this always followed the same pattern. Bright lights, louder deals, and people trying to pretend the darker corners didn't exist. He slung a worn tool bag over his shoulder and followed a blinking sign toward the salvage exchange, boots echoing softly against the alloy floor panels. Somewhere deeper in the station, a crowd had gathered. He heard the murmur first, that low, curious sound people make when they're watching something they shouldn't quite enjoy, but do anyway. Jack slowed. Curiosity had gotten him into trouble before, but ignoring it never came naturally. The corridor widened into a circular chamber lined with observation balconies and flickering auction screens. A transparent containment field shimmered faintly in the center of the room. Jack almost turned away. Almost. But then he saw her. She stood inside the field beneath a ring of sterile white lights, tall and still, her skin a soft shade of deep blue that reflected the glow like polished glass. Silver markings traced delicate patterns along her arms, not jewelry. Not tattoos exactly, something natural and quiet like frost on a window. Around her neck rested a narrow metallic collar connected to a small control device held by the auctioneer. A digital display rotated above her head. Personal companion contract, certified obedience, starting bid 40,000 credits. Jack frowned. He had seen indenture contracts before on fringe colonies, but something about this felt different, colder somehow. The alien woman didn't look frightened. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from missing sleep, but the kind that settles into a person when the world has been deciding things for them too long. The auctioneer cleared his throat with theatrical enthusiasm. Ladies and gentlemen of the station, a rare opportunity tonight. High intelligence, excellent health metrics, fully compliant under companion law. A perfect addition to any private estate. A few people chuckled softly. Jack felt something tighten in his chest. The woman's eyes moved slowly across the room, scanning the crowd not with desperation, but with quiet defiance. When those eyes passed over Jack, they paused for half a second. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't hope. It was simply awareness, like she was acknowledging another living person in a room that had decided she wasn't one. Jack shifted his weight, suddenly aware of the heavy silence around him, the blinking credit displays, the comfortable spectators leaning against railings. He checked his pocket out of habit, even though he already knew what he would find. 32 credits. Not enough to fix his reactor, not enough to leave orbit comfortably, and definitely not enough to change anything happening in this room. The auctioneer raised his hand. Opening bid. Jack should have walked away right then. Instead, he kept watching. The first bid appeared on the central display with a quiet electronic chime. 40,000 credits. Another number followed almost immediately. Then another. Each voice in the crowd calm and businesslike, as if they were negotiating over cargo containers instead of a living person standing beneath cold white lights. Jack folded his arms and leaned against the railing, telling himself it was none of his concern. He had come here to sell a salvage power regulator and buy a new fuel cell, nothing more. Yet his eyes kept drifting back to the containment field. The alien woman had not moved. She stood straight, hands loosely at her sides, silver markings across her blue skin catching the light every time someone shifted in the audience. The collar around her neck emitted a faint hum, barely audible beneath the chatter of the room. Jack had worked around enough machinery to recognize the sound of an active control circuit. The auctioneer's voice rolled smoothly across the chamber. 50,000 credits. 60,000. A man in a polished uniform lifted 2 fingers from a balcony seat, without even looking up from his data tablet. The numbers climbed with the steady rhythm of people who had more money than patience. Jack glanced again at the digital sign above the containment field. Personal companion contract. Certified obedience. The words felt sterile, carefully engineered to hide what they actually meant. He had seen similar contracts on fringe mining colonies where desperate workers signed away years of their lives for transportation off a dying planet. Those contracts had been ugly enough. This felt worse. The alien woman's gaze shifted across the room once more. This time it lingered on a tall merchant standing near the front row. The merchant smiled faintly and lifted his bidding paddle. The auction display flashed again. 80,000 credits. The crowd murmured with approval. Jack exhaled slowly through his nose. 80,000 credits was more money than he had seen in a single transaction in years. His entire shuttle might sell for half that on a generous day. He rubbed the back of his neck and tried to turn away. Yet something about the way the woman held herself refused to leave his mind. She was not performing for the buyers. She was enduring them. There was a difference. The auctioneer adjusted the small control device in his hand and spoke again. 90,000 credits. The collar around the woman's neck pulsed softly with light, as if reminding the audience who was in charge of the situation. The alien woman blinked once and looked toward the ceiling where the station's observation windows revealed the endless darkness of space beyond. Jack followed her gaze. Out there, a few hundred miles away, his old shuttle floated quietly in docking bay 12, patched together from a dozen salvage jobs and held together by stubborn engineering and luck. It was the only real thing he owned in the galaxy. The auctioneer's voice cut through the chamber again. 95,000 credits. The merchant in the front row raised his paddle without hesitation. The display confirmed the new bid. Jack felt the room settle into that familiar pause that happens when buyers decide whether to continue or walk away. He told himself to leave. Sell the regulator. Buy the fuel cell. Fix the shuttle and get back to work. A simple life was easier that way. Then the alien woman lowered her eyes from the window and looked directly into the crowd again. For a moment, the entire room seemed to disappear for Jack. There was no fear in her expression, no pleading, only quiet recognition, as if she understood exactly how the room saw her and had already decided she would not let it define who she was. Jack straightened slowly from the railing. The silence stretched. The auctioneer glanced around the chamber. 100,000 credits, he announced. Do I hear 100,000 credits? Jack opened his mouth before his brain could catch up with the words forming behind his teeth. The words left Jack Walker's mouth before caution could stop them. 100,000 credits. The sound of his own voice echoed strangely across the auction chamber, not loud, but clear enough that every head in the room turned toward him. For a moment, even the auctioneer looked confused, as if trying to locate the owner of the voice among the balconies and railings. Then the central display blinked and registered the bid. 100,000 credits confirmed. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Jack felt his heartbeat thudding steadily in his chest, while dozens of unfamiliar eyes studied him with curiosity, amusement, or quiet disbelief. The merchant near the front leaned back slightly, examining Jack with the relaxed patience of someone used to winning negotiations. Jack suddenly became aware of the grease stains on his jacket, the scuffed boots, and the fact that he looked exactly like what he was, a frontier mechanic with more stubbornness than money. The auctioneer recovered quickly and smiled with renewed enthusiasm. 100,000 credits has been offered. Do I hear 110? The merchant lifted his paddle almost lazily. 110,000 credits. The display updated with a soft chime. The room relaxed again, as if the brief interruption had corrected itself. Jack exhaled slowly through his nose. Of course the merchant had deeper pockets. People like that always did. For a second Jack considered stepping back, letting the bid go where it was always going to go. He could still pretend the whole moment had been an impulsive mistake. Then he looked back toward the containment field. The alien woman had not moved, but her eyes had found him again. She was studying him now with a new expression, something thoughtful and almost cautious. Not hope, not expectation, just curiosity, like she was trying to understand why a stranger in worn work clothes had suddenly changed the direction of a room full of wealthy buyers. Jack straightened his shoulders and lifted his hand slightly. 120,000 credits, he said. This time the room fell completely silent. Even the station air recyclers seemed quieter. The auctioneer blinked, clearly pleased by the rising numbers. The merchant lowered his paddle and watched Jack carefully, his calm smile fading into something more analytical. A few spectators whispered among themselves. Jack knew what they were thinking. Mechanics did not make bids like that. Salvage workers did not walk into luxury auctions and start throwing around numbers that could purchase entire cargo ships. The merchant finally raised his paddle again. 130,000 credits. His voice carried a polite confidence that suggested the game would end soon. Jack felt the familiar pressure building behind his ribs, the same stubborn instinct that had pushed him through broken reactors and long repair nights, when quitting would have been easier. He glanced toward the ceiling window again, where the stars drifted slowly past the station hall. Somewhere out there sat his shuttle, patched together over years of work, the only real investment he had in the entire galaxy. He lowered his gaze back to the auction floor and spoke without raising his voice. I offer one ship. Docking Bay 12. A long-range utility shuttle with a functional reactor and registered ownership transfer. The chamber froze. The auctioneer stared at him in disbelief for half a second before quickly accessing the station registry. The screens around the room flickered with verification data. Estimated value 150,000 credits. The merchant slowly lowered his paddle and leaned back in his chair. A few spectators gasped softly as the numbers finalized across the display. The auctioneer cleared his throat and lifted his gavel with renewed excitement. One utility vessel valued at 150,000 credits. Final call. The gavel struck the podium with a clean metallic tap. Sold. The containment field flickered quietly as the transaction completed, and for the first time since Jack had entered the chamber, the alien woman allowed herself the smallest breath of surprise. For several seconds Jack Walker did not move. The room was still watching him, some with curiosity, some with disbelief, but the auction was already over. The containment field around the alien woman dissolved with a soft electrical whisper, its shimmering surface collapsing into nothing more than empty air. The auctioneer spoke quickly with station clerks while data confirmation scrolled across the surrounding displays, transferring ownership of Docking Bay 12's aging shuttle to the station registry. Jack barely noticed. His attention had shifted entirely to the woman, now standing without the barrier between them. Up close, she appeared taller than he first thought, perhaps 6 feet if measured by Earth standards, with that same deep blue skin reflecting the overhead lights like calm water beneath moonlight. The silver markings along her arms and collarbone were more intricate than he realized earlier, almost like natural constellations etched across her skin. The metallic collar still rested around her neck, its small indicator light pulsing softly. A station attendant approached Jack with a thin digital tablet. Please confirm transfer authorization. Jack placed his thumb on the screen without hesitation. The tablet chimed softly. Transfer accepted. Your vessel now belongs to the Station Auction Authority. Jack released a slow breath he did not realize he had been holding. 8 years of work, repair contracts, long cargo routes through quiet star systems, all traded away in a single moment. Strangely, the loss did not feel as heavy as he expected. The attendant nodded and stepped aside. The alien woman was escorted out of the auction circle by 2 uniformed station staff members who maintained professional distance, treating the situation like routine business rather than spectacle. When she reached the edge of the platform, she stopped in front of Jack. For the first time they stood face to face without a containment field or auction lights separating them. Her eyes were a pale silver color, reflective and steady. She studied him in silence for a moment before speaking. Her voice was calm and surprisingly soft. You traded your ship. Jack rubbed the back of his neck and gave a small shrug. It was an old ship anyway. She glanced briefly toward the nearby window where distant stars glimmered beyond the station hall. That vessel represented your mobility, your income, and likely your residence. Jack chuckled quietly. When you say it like that, it sounds like a terrible decision. Her expression did not change, but something thoughtful moved behind her eyes. Why did you do it? Jack considered the question for a moment. The room around them had already begun returning to normal activity. New bidders gathered for the next auction item, while the earlier crowd dispersed through the corridors. To most people, the moment had already ended. Jack looked at the collar around her neck. Because that thing should not be on anyone. The woman lowered her gaze slightly toward the device, as if noticing it for the first time since leaving the containment field. The small light blinked again. Station regulations require it remain active until contract verification is complete, she said quietly. Jack frowned. How long does that take? The attendant nearby glanced at his console. Approximately 15 minutes. Jack crossed his arms and leaned lightly against the railing. Then I guess we have 15 minutes before we start fixing the situation. The alien woman looked at him again, this time with a faint shift in her expression, something between surprise and cautious curiosity. Most purchasers do not discuss removing the control collar so quickly. Jack tilted his head slightly. I did not buy you to control you. The words hung in the air between them for a moment. The faint hum of the collar continued, but something else had already begun changing. Something quieter and far more important than ownership records or station contracts. For the first time since Jack had entered the auction hall, the alien woman allowed herself the smallest, almost imperceptible breath of relief. The small indicator light on the collar blinked slowly while the station clock above the auction chamber counted down the remaining minutes of contract verification. Jack Walker leaned against the railing with the relaxed posture of someone who had already accepted the consequences of his decisions. Across from him, the blue-skinned woman stood quietly, her silver eyes moving occasionally toward the busy corridors where traders and travelers continued their routines without paying them much attention. For everyone else on the station, the moment had already passed, just another transaction completed in a place built on transactions. For Jack, it felt like the beginning of something he did not fully understand yet. The station attendant checked his console again and nodded toward Jack. Contract verification complete in approximately 3 minutes. Jack gave a small nod of appreciation and looked back at the woman. He realized suddenly that they had been standing there for several minutes without exchanging something as simple as a name. My name is Jack Walker, he said, extending his hand slightly in a human gesture of introduction. The woman studied the offered hand carefully, as if analyzing the meaning behind it. After a brief pause, she mirrored the gesture, her long blue fingers lightly touching his. Lyra Vesh, she said. Her voice carried a smooth musical tone that reminded Jack faintly of wind moving through glass chimes. Jack smiled slightly. Lyra, that is a good name. She tilted her head with quiet curiosity. It is a constellation in your night sky, is it not? Jack blinked once and laughed softly. You know human star charts. Lyra released his hand and folded her arms loosely in front of her. I studied several cultures during my education. My people value knowledge of other civilizations. Jack raised an eyebrow. That does not sound like the background of someone meant for auctions. Her silver eyes shifted briefly toward the collar again, but she did not answer the implication directly. Circumstances change quickly in the wider galaxy, she said calmly. The station attendant approached with a small handheld device. Contract verification is complete. Control collar authorization now belongs to you. Jack looked at the device and then at the collar around Lyra's neck. How do I remove it? The attendant handed him a slim metal key-shaped interface. Insert this here and hold for 5 seconds. Standard safety protocol. Jack stepped closer to Lyra. Up close, he could see faint lines in the metal ring where it connected behind her neck. You okay with this? He asked quietly. Lyra looked directly into his eyes. You purchased the authority. Jack shook his head gently. That was not the question. For the first time since they had met, Lyra seemed momentarily unsure how to respond. After a second, she gave a slow nod. Yes. Jack inserted the interface key into the small slot and pressed gently. The collar emitted a soft tone, and the pulsing light faded until it disappeared entirely. With a quiet mechanical click, the ring separated and slid open. Jack lifted it away carefully and handed the inactive device back to the attendant. The sudden absence of the collar left a faint indentation on Lyra's skin. She raised a hand slowly and touched the place where it had rested. For several seconds, she said nothing. Jack watched her expression change in subtle ways. Not dramatic or emotional, just the quiet realization that something heavy had been removed. Freedom, when it arrives unexpectedly, rarely announces itself loudly. Lyra lowered her hand and looked at Jack again with a thoughtful calm. In my culture, she said slowly, when someone gives another being their freedom, it creates a bond of honor. Jack scratched his chin lightly. Well, where I come from, we just call it doing the right thing. Lyra considered that answer for a moment, then allowed the faintest trace of a smile to appear. The quiet click of the collar unlocking seemed to change the air around them in a way Jack could not fully explain. Lyra stood still for a few seconds, her fingers resting lightly on the spot where the metal ring had been only moments ago. Around them, the station had already returned to its normal rhythm. Traders walked past carrying cargo cases, holographic advertisements flickered across the corridor walls, and somewhere in the distance a transport shuttle rumbled as it prepared for departure. Life in orbit never paused for long. Jack shifted his weight and glanced toward the observation window again, where the black ocean of space stretched endlessly beyond the station hull. A few cargo freighters drifted slowly through the docking lanes, their navigation lights blinking like quiet stars. "Well," he said after a moment, "the first problem is solved." Lyra lowered her hand and looked at him. "Your definition of problem appears unusual." Jack gave a small grin. "I lost a ship and gained a very confusing afternoon. That sounds like a problem to me." Lyra studied his expression carefully, as if trying to determine whether he was serious or joking. "Your vessel represented significant value. You surrendered it without negotiation." Jack shrugged lightly. "I have rebuilt worse situations from less. A person who works in salvage learns to start over a lot." She considered that statement in silence for a few seconds. "Among my people," she said slowly, "personal sacrifice for a stranger would be considered an act of deep loyalty." Jack leaned against the railing again. "Among my people it is usually called stubbornness." The faint smile returned to Lyra's face, a little more natural this time. "Your culture seems less formal about honor." Jack scratched his jaw thoughtfully. "We still believe in it. We just do not write long speeches about it." Lyra turned slightly and looked through the observation window. The reflected stars shimmered across her silver eyes. "When someone frees another being in my society," she said quietly, "it creates a bond called varashi." Jack tilted his head. "That sounds important." "It is," she replied. "Varashi means the two lives become connected by choice rather than obligation. The one who receives freedom is expected to protect the one who gave it whenever possible." Jack raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like a lot of responsibility for one afternoon." Lyra glanced back toward him. "Responsibility can begin in very small moments." Jack let that thought settle while the steady hum of the station filled the silence between them. For the first time since he had placed the bid in the auction chamber, he allowed himself to consider what came next. He no longer had a ship waiting in docking bay 12. His tools and personal gear had been inside that shuttle as well. In practical terms, he had traded away his entire working life in the span of 10 minutes. Yet strangely, the situation did not feel like a disaster. It felt more like standing at the edge of a new road that had not existed an hour ago. He glanced at Lyra again. "So what happens now?" She looked at him with calm certainty. "Now I decide how to repay the life you returned to me." Jack chuckled quietly. "You do not owe me anything." Lyra shook her head slightly. "That is where our cultures differ again, Jack Walker." She paused, then spoke with gentle seriousness. "Freedom is never considered a small gift where I come from." Jack Walker rested his elbows lightly on the railing while the station lights reflected across the wide observation window. Freighters moved slowly through the docking lanes like patient metal animals, guided by quiet navigation signals and invisible traffic control systems. The universe outside the glass looked calm and endless, but inside the station every corridor hummed with trade, movement, and the quiet urgency of 1,000 different lives crossing paths for a few brief hours. Lyra stood beside him with a stillness that felt deliberate rather than uncertain. Without the collar around her neck, her posture had changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough that Jack could see the difference. The tension that had once been hidden in the set of her shoulders was gone. She moved like someone who had regained control of her own balance. Jack finally broke the silence. "So, Lyra Vesh, if you insist that I did something important, what exactly were you doing before you ended up in that auction room?" Lyra looked toward the passing ships again before answering. "I was traveling between diplomatic academies when my transport route was intercepted by a private syndicate vessel." Jack nodded slowly. That sounded exactly like the kind of trouble frontier stations quietly pretended not to notice. He glanced sideways at her. "You speak like someone with a lot of education." Lyra turned her silver eyes toward him. "I spent most of my life studying political history and interspecies law." Jack gave a low whistle. "That explains the vocabulary." She seemed faintly amused. "My instructors would appreciate that comment." Jack rubbed the back of his neck and looked down at the metal floor beneath his boots. For a moment, he imagined the long list of practical problems waiting for him now. No ship meant no transport contracts. No transport contracts meant no income. Yet somehow the situation did not feel like failure. It felt like the beginning of a complicated story he had not planned to write. Lyra watched him carefully for a moment. "You are calculating your future options," she said quietly. Jack chuckled. "Is it that obvious?" "Your eyes move toward the docking lanes every few seconds," she replied. "That usually indicates someone thinking about transportation." Jack could not argue with that logic. Old habits from years of navigation work were difficult to hide. He glanced toward the bay where his shuttle had once been listed in the station registry. "Guess I will need to find a new ride eventually." Lyra studied him thoughtfully. "My people maintain diplomatic vessels across several systems." Jack raised his eyebrows. "That sounds expensive." "It is," she said calmly. Jack laughed softly and shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, but I did not help you so I could join a royal convoy." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "You assume my background incorrectly." Jack looked at her again. "You talk like a diplomat and you mentioned academies earlier. That usually means important families and very formal dinners." Lyra was silent for a few seconds before answering. "My home world participates in a council of planetary alliances. My family represents one of the founding houses." Jack blinked once and stared at her. "Wait a second. You are telling me I traded my entire ship for someone who belongs to an interstellar council?" "Family." Lyra did not appear embarrassed by the statement. "That is an accurate summary of events." Jack slowly leaned back against the railing and let out a long breath. "Well, that explains why the auction price kept climbing." Lyra watched his reaction carefully. "Does this knowledge change how you see the situation?" Response: a powerful council family might have to discovering one of their members had been sold through a frontier auction. Probably a response that would make station administrators very nervous. Lyra studied him again. "You appear unconcerned by the possible political consequences." Jack smiled faintly. "After today, I do not have a ship, a contract, or a schedule. I am temporarily immune to complicated politics." Lyra allowed herself another small smile. "That may be the most unusual diplomatic strategy one have ever heard." Jack tilted his head toward her. "You said something earlier about a bond your people recognize." "Varashi." "Yes," she said quietly. Jack looked thoughtful. "If that bond connects our futures, then I guess we will find out what happens next together." Lyra's silver eyes reflected the distant stars as she considered his words. "Among my people, Varashi is often sealed through a formal declaration before witnesses." Jack raised an eyebrow. "I am guessing that ceremony involves a lot of speeches." Lyra nodded once. "Many speeches." Jack laughed softly. "Well, we are currently standing in the middle of a shipping station surrounded by cargo haulers and repair crews. I am not sure that qualifies as a formal ceremony." Lyra turned toward him fully now. Her expression had grown calm and serious in a way that carried quiet significance. "Formal settings are not what define the bond," she said. "The choice itself defines it." Jack studied her for a moment, realizing that whatever this moment meant to her culture carried weight far beyond the casual way he had been treating the situation. Before he could respond, a sudden shift in the light beyond the observation window drew both of their attention. A large vessel had just emerged from hyperspace near the outer navigation perimeter. Its hull shimmered with elegant silver patterns that caught the starlight in graceful lines. Even from a distance, the ship carried the unmistakable presence of diplomatic authority. Lyra looked at the vessel and spoke with quiet recognition. "That is one of ours." The silver diplomatic vessel drifted slowly into the station approach corridor, its hull reflecting the distant stars in smooth luminous curves that made every cargo ship nearby look suddenly crude and industrial. Jack Walker rested his arms on the railing and stared at the ship with quiet appreciation. Even from half a mile away, he could tell the craft had been built with the kind of engineering budget that frontier mechanics like him only read about in technical journals. Lyra stood beside him without speaking, her silver eyes focused on the approaching vessel with calm familiarity rather than surprise. A soft voice from the station's overhead communication system echoed through the corridor. "Unidentified diplomatic vessel requesting priority docking clearance. Authorization codes confirmed. Docking path granted." Several cargo haulers immediately shifted their course to clear the lane as the elegant ship glided forward with effortless precision. Jack gave a low whistle under his breath. "That is one impressive ride." Lyra nodded once. "It belongs to the Azure Council fleet." Jack tilted his head slightly. "So your people found you faster than expected." "My people do not delay when one of their representatives disappears," she replied quietly. The vessel rotated gracefully and aligned with one of the primary diplomatic docking arms extending from the station hull. A moment later, several smaller escort craft detached from its underside and moved into protective formation, their lights blinking in steady patterns that suggested both security and ceremony. Jack watched the display thoughtfully. Well, that answers the question of what happens next. Lyra turned toward him. Does it? Jack shrugged lightly. Seems obvious. Your people arrive, you go home, and they probably spend a few days yelling at whoever allowed an auction like that to happen in the first place. Lyra studied him for a moment before speaking. That may be part of what happens. Jack noticed she did not say it would be the only part. He shifted slightly and glanced back toward the docking lanes where the diplomatic ship had now fully secured itself to the station arm. Small transport shuttles were already launching from its bays, heading toward the central concourse where official receptions usually took place. Jack exhaled slowly and pushed himself away from the railing. Well, Lyra Vesh, looks like your ride is here. Lyra did not move immediately. Instead, she watched him with the same thoughtful expression she had used several times since their first conversation. You are assuming I will leave immediately. Jack raised an eyebrow. That is usually how rescue ships work. Lyra took a step closer to the observation window, the starlight reflecting softly across her blue skin. When someone forms a Varashi bond in my culture, she said quietly, the two lives connected by that bond are no longer considered separate paths. Jack folded his arms again. I remember you saying something about that earlier. He glanced toward the diplomatic vessel again, and then back at her. But your council probably has certain expectations about where you belong. Lyra turned fully toward him now, her expression calm and certain. My council will ask many questions. Jack nodded slowly. I figured. Lyra held his gaze and continued speaking with gentle clarity. One of those questions will be who gave me back my freedom. Jack looked briefly toward the floor before meeting her eyes again. I imagine that will be an interesting conversation. Lyra allowed a small smile to appear. Yes, it will. Jack scratched the back of his neck and looked again at the stars beyond the glass. For the first time since the auction ended, he felt the quiet weight of the day settling into perspective. A few hours earlier, he had been a mechanic with a ship and a routine. Now he had neither of those things. Yet strangely, the future did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt open. Lyra spoke again, her voice calm and steady beside him. In my culture, when someone restores another person's dignity, the bond created by that act can lead to many possible futures. Jack glanced sideways at her. That sounds like the beginning of a long story. Lyra looked toward the distant stars and then back at him. It is. And for the first time since entering the station, Jack Walker realized that sometimes the most important journeys did not begin with a ship at all.